Good afternoon. Welcome to the high-level panel discussion on managing growth for social inclusion in South Asia. It is my pleasure to present to you our guest of honor, Professor Rahman Sobhan, Chairman, Center for Policy Dialogue. We are very delighted to have Professor Wahiduddin Mahmud, Eminent Economist of Bangladesh, as the Honorable Chair. Our distinguished panelists are Dr. Selim Raihan, Executive Director, SANEM, and Professor at the Department of Economics of University of Dhaka. Dr. Mustafizur Rahman, Executive Director, Center for Policy Dialogue. Dr. Saman Kelegama, Executive Director at Institute of Policy Studies, Sri Lanka. Dr. Posh Pandey, Chairman, South Asia Watch and Trade, Economics and Environment, Nepal. And Dr. Sabyasachi, Professor at the Institute of Economic Growth, India.
Dr. Sultan, he may join later because he's on Dr.
Yes, and we also have with us later Dr. Sultan Hafeez Rahman, Executive Director, BRAC Institute of Governance and Development, BIGD. May I please request our chair, Professor Wahiduddin Mahmud, to start the
Thank
session.
you. Thank you. It's so nice to see that even in this afternoon session, there is such a good attendance. Those of our friends who are from abroad may not know that it's quite rare that at the end of the one-day seminar, there is such a good, and I can assure you that this is a combination. The audience really combines very high-level researchers, even Bangladeshi researchers from abroad, you yourself from abroad, and policymakers, stakeholders, my colleagues from Dhaka University, and I'm so glad that the students from universities, Dhaka University, North-South University, and others are here very enthusiastically participating. I just talked to them. I'm so happy that it all goes to the entrepreneurship of Selim Raihan, one of my very brilliant and successful students, that such a seminar could be organized. And not only that, but I know that among our regional organizations, SANEM is one of the most lively and active organizations to have continue to thrive over last, how many years? 10 years, which is quite rare for any South Asian institution. Even look at, what is our South Asian? Any other South Asian forums, rarely continue to function with such flourishing activities. So, okay, we have a panel of economists. Among academics or professionals, we don't designate anything by high level or low level. We are all professionals and academics of very high standard. We have, I don't have to, again, call everybody's name. So I will request Dr. Selim Raihan to first start the discussion with it. Each panel, if we can divide it is 1.5 hours into 10 minutes for each panelist, then we will be home and dry before the dinner, which will be at 7.
Thank you, sir. It is my privilege and I think a bit emotional to have both Professor Rahman Sobhan and Professor Wahiduddin Mahmud, and I'm on the same dais, so I'm a bit emotional, but thank you so much for sirs to being with us. While preparing this PowerPoint presentation, I was a bit scared because what I thought that I might be heavily criticized for something which I'm going to present to you now. Because what I'm going to present to you now, it is something the approach I took a bit simplistic approach to understand the social inclusion and how we can kind of link social inclusion with growth. What I'm not really going to do to make any suggestion, but to present to you some kinds of features. Some kinds of features and some pattern which emerges is looking at the data, and then whether we can deduce something from that analysis, from looking at this data. So please forgive me if I'm too simplistic, but as I said, my intention was not to make things complicated, but to understand things in a bit of simple way. So what really motivated me to construct a social inclusion index? So what I did, I took data for 156 countries. The reason is 156, that magic number, is because I got really data for those countries. And for those time period between 2000 and 2015, 16 years. And then I had 26 variables, because I tried to understand social inclusion from the perspective of access to basic services, access to education, health, and then different social services, labor force participation, life expectancy, different infant mortality rate, maternal mortality rate, even inequality like Gini index, and also included one perspective like cost of business startup procedures, just to give a proxy of how difficult that business environment is in that. So if the business environment is very difficult, that means that process is not very is not very inclusive. In addition to these variables, I also added 6 institutional variables from world governance indicators: voice and accountability, political stability, government effectiveness, regulatory quality, rule of law, and control of corruption. So what I did, I then kind of, instead of going into very complicated analysis, trying to have different weights for different indicators, because we know that when you construct an index, you need of weights for that. What I did, I actually hadn't kind of normalized them between 0 and 100, then I had a simple average of these indicators. The reason I did not choose for PCA using multiple principal component analysis to derive different weights, because what happens for different time periods, I will get different weights for different variables. So which may be a kind of subject to criticism anyway. I'll be subject to criticism, I know that, but using the simple average method. But I thought probably that would have been more unrealistic. So let's look, after looking at this, I constructed this social inclusion index. And then I will just present to you a bit of South Asian context. Based on this index, where these South Asian countries are. So actually, Afghanistan is at the bottom. So starting from 2000, the index was around 24, 25, and it has been, by 2015, the index is around less than 40. So actually, the top countries are like the European and North American countries. They're at above 90. Some of them are actually close to 80. So the index varies between 0 and 100. So you can see Afghanistan, the movement of Afghanistan, and here comes Pakistan, actually between 40 and 50, that development, that index. But then, actually, interestingly, Bangladesh, this is green is Bangladesh, and you can see Bangladesh actually moved almost hand in hand with Pakistan until 2006 and 7. Then Bangladesh's progress was a bit upward, and then that divergence is actually, in terms of index, the positive higher value is the higher social inclusion, and that actually developed. India, that's the India now, and India is actually, you can see the gap between Bangladesh and India in the early 2000s, actually it was wider, but then in the later period, actually the gap was reduced, and Bangladesh could kind of catch up India. And in recent years, actually the gaps are very, very small. And the Nepal, this is something probably I really need to understand from Dr. Posh Pandey. Now, how come Nepal appears to be higher in terms of social inclusion index, compared to both Pakistan, Bangladesh, and India? Sri Lanka is above all. You can't touch Sri Lanka. So Dr. Saman Kelegama can probably explain why Sri Lanka is so up there. It's in the range of higher upper middle income country and the kind of sometimes in some European country standards. Now, between 2000 and 2015, if we look at these countries and the point change, and the index point change, you can see, I just highlighted for Bangladesh. Bangladesh is actually very kind of the second position after Bhutan, And then even in the percentage change, Bangladesh is the second after Afghanistan. Afghanistan's a high percentage change because it has already a low base, so the high percentage change makes sense. But Bangladesh has actually made a huge progress compared to other South Asian countries, both in terms of index point change as well as the percentage change. I also tried to look at then I tried to look at the global ranking out of 156 countries between 2000 and 2015. Bangladesh in 2000 was 118 out of 2015 to 156 countries, but in 2015 Bangladesh ranking improved. So that makes the case that it's not only in the absolute term, but also in relative term, Bangladesh made progress during those 15 or 16 years. India, no change almost. 109 to 108, almost or just one during those 16 years. Nepal, 108 to improvement, is the higher you are in the ranking, that means your improvement. And Sri Lanka, Pakistan, deterioration from 117 to 119, and Sri Lanka 60 to 55. So Sri Lankan case already they had high in the ranking, and also during this last 16 years they moved up. Interestingly, then what I did, I had this 16 years and then 156 countries. Altogether, I had around 2,500 observations. So I put them into this scatter plot, and I wanted to see whether I can find some relation against the log of GDP per capita, so against the per capita GDP. So here you can see the top, the corner, that circle, actually those are the countries, advanced European Union countries, as well as the North American countries. Now there comes the East Asia, Southeast Asia, and upper middle income countries are blocked there. And then you can see the last part is the sub-Saharan African countries. One interesting observation, probably it's my argument, is that the upper part, the upper righter part of that, you can see a kind of trend line also. That part is actually where at the higher income level, the social inclusion index is kind of consistent. You can see the kind of convergence. But at the lower income level, you can see the high divergence among countries. And that makes the story very interesting. You know, how even with the kind of same kind of income level, why some countries have different social inclusion experiences. Take this example between Bangladesh and India. So there is a trend line. I'm not sure whether you can see that blue line, the straight line in between. So the red dot line, Bangladesh in 2000, and then you can see that, does it work, that laser? The laser doesn't work. Anyway, so there is a movement. Can I get the laser, please? The movement of Bangladesh from 2000 to 2015, and the movement of India between 2000 and 2015. So you can see the kind of change. And if I want to make the case very clearly, that look at Bangladesh and India in 2015, and look at the income differences, per capita income differences between these two countries. Despite the fact that Bangladesh had lower per capita income in PPP term compared to India, Bangladesh's social inclusion index was almost as same as India's. So I want to know, and I want to really pose these questions: why Bangladesh could perform well, in the South Asian countries. But we should not be very happy with this, because Bangladesh's 2015 case at the same per capita income level was actually much lower than what Vietnam had in 2004 at the same per capita income level. So if I compare between Bangladesh and Vietnam, you can see Bangladesh is actually even 11 years before now, or in Bangladesh in 2015. So Vietnam in 2004 at the almost similar per capita income level had much higher level of social inclusion index than Bangladesh. And same is hold for Vietnam now when it compares to India. I really want to understand, probably those to the eminent panelists, they'll talk about this, how different factors can explain, apart from growth or per capita income, what really matters in social inclusion. Look at India and Vietnam. Now in 2015, almost similar per capita income, but Vietnam has a very much higher social inclusion index than India. With this, I would like to conclude here, and I would like to take questions and probably what implications arise from this kind of analysis during the question and answer period. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Raihan. I don't think we can answer all your puzzles at this, but we can continue to think about this. Particularly, Siddiq is there, he's the expert on these things. Next issue of the Journal of the Human Development could devote to this. Okay, it's my pleasure now to invite Mustafizur. Mustafizur Rahman, Executive Director, Center for Policy Dialogue.
Thank you, sir. It's a great honor, dear guests, to speak in the presence of Professor Rehman, Sobhan, Professor Wahiduddin Mahmud, and Dr. Esar Usmani, who have been the pioneers in dealing with the issues that are on the table today. And Selim has also put the bigger picture before us. So I will try to come down a bit to the country level and try to decipher how, as last point that Selim has made, why with the similar level of development, the distinction between Vietnam and some of the other countries. So I think that what boils down to, the discourse boils down to the nature of growth. If you look at Piketty, Capitalism in the 21st Century, he has a very small equation over there. He says that the root of the increasing inequality is that R is greater than G, which means that returns on wealth is greater than the GDP growth rate. And that has been the major root of inequality. But perhaps that is in the context of the developed countries. In the context of the developing country, I think it is not so much as R greater than G, but the nature of G itself, how the growth takes place. I think that's what we will need to really look at, and it can answer many of the questions. If we look at now, for example, in the context of the SDGs, the issue has been raised with regard to reducing inequality between countries and inequality within the country also. So it has also become a major global commitment to reduce inequality across countries and also within countries. And so that also brings us to not only our national policies, but also the nature of globalization that we have and which impacts on our national economic dynamics. I think that these two are both important in terms of explaining the nature of inclusive growth and social inclusion in our growth process. And that brings me to my second point with regard to the nature of growth. Now, if you look at, and we all know that the agriculture contributes about 17% of the GDP and about 46% of the employment is in agriculture, which would mean that even in the context of our countries, the productivity in agriculture is way below the productivity that we have, average productivity, national productivity. 46% of the labor was contributing only 17% of the GDP. So that's, but on the other hand, if we can have an agriculture-driven growth process, not agriculture-driven, but equal participation of agriculture, I think that the social inclusion capacity will be that much higher. And in one of the recent works by Dr. Bias and his colleagues, he has shown that if we can increase agriculture rural income by 1%, the reduction in poverty will be about 3 times. At 0.39% was the poverty reduction. If it is non-agriculture, it is only 0.11. So almost 3.5 times capacity of agriculture. So I think that one of the major reasons of non-inclusive growth process in many of the developing countries is the silent rural-urban resource transfer that is taking place. We don't talk about this in these days because we have learned from Faye Rennie's theories that it was taking place, but now we don't hear so much. But I think that if we would have done analysis in the context of what is happening between the rural economy and the urban economy, I think that one of the major causes of non-inclusive growth, and if we also relate to what Dr. Bias and others have found out, I think that can explain. So what is happening with regard to the rural-urban resource transfer? What is happening with the price level between urban goods and rural goods? We see that there has been a serious erosion of the purchasing power of the income of the rural economy because of the transfer of resources and through transfer of resources to the price mechanism. So I think that if you look at the credit market, if you look at the goods market, if you look at the financial market, there is a serious problem over there. And that can also explain some of the root causes of non-inclusive growth rate. And the third point is obviously, if in the context of Bangladesh and many other countries, we see that there is a disjuncture between the rise of the productive forces and the production relations. Now, this is a Marxist term, and we are way now beyond Marxist analysis these days. But if you look at the research by Professor Rehman Sobhan, his seminal book on challenging the injustice of poverty in South Asia, one can read this hypothesis between the lines. Even Sar doesn't mention about the Marxist legacy from which I think his ideas have also been influenced a lot. But we can see that the way that he looks at inclusive growth in the context of South Asia is ownership pattern, the structural injustices, the participation of the poor in the market, the participation of the poor in the financial market, the scaling up of the microfinance to higher finance levels so that the poor can get access to not only small credit but also higher levels of credit. So I think that that is one part. The second sub-point that he mentions about is, of course, the broadening of the ownership. Now, of course, no one is talking about land reform type of ownership, but still, for example, the reforms in the tenancy market, the reforms in the government, the assets owned by the government. So there is also a major issue, I think, which he mentions in his in his book. So I think that if we look at the growth pattern that has been pursued in our country, and if we broaden what is the definition of social inclusion has been mentioned, if we take, for example, the Alkiri-Foster definition, which is more of a broader one, although there is problem of data in the context of Bangladesh, but I think that if we take that broader perspective of multidimensional poverty and see define social inclusion in the context of those, we will find out that there is lot of at disaggregated level, there is lot of differences even within countries, within regions, rural, urban, peri-urban, urban, because we are seeing that more poverty is now emerging in the peri-urban areas where you don't have social safety net programs in the rural areas and also don't have the various employment opportunities in the urban for the urban poor. So those type of disaggregated dynamics of non-inclusive growth also emerges from that type of analysis. Now, the last point that I'd like to say, and it is also important in the context of SDGs, is the data revolution. I think that there is a lot of deficits over there in the context of the SDGs. We will not be really able to monitor the 17 targets, goals and 169 targets because we don't have the information. Even in the context of Bangladesh, the Hayes data was only representative at the divisional level. And now only we are talking about district level. So if we cannot measure, we cannot monitor. We cannot monitor, we cannot implement. So that's the other one. The last point is obviously the nature of globalization. I think that you see, and that also brings me to the nature of growth. In the agriculture sector, we are importing fertilizer, agricultural inputs at the global prices. Either the farmers pay or the state pays, and then you extract through direct and indirect taxes. So someone is paying. But it is the global prices. But when the farmers are participating in the market, it is mainly the domestic market because we are not being able to connect the rural producers with the global market because there are stringent rules of origin requirements, SPS, TBT, various standard certification, laboratory testing requirements. So we are not being able to. So that we are not being able to give the farmers the due. The marketing remains a major problem. In Professor Rehman Sobhan's book, he mentions about cooperatives, whether that is the best model because it has also been tested in some countries like Amul. It is a very good example, but some others have tried to replicate. But I think that one of the major roots of this disjoint is that the farmers are not being able to get the benefits of the globalization, and there are a lot of hindrances, and that's what we will also have to address. And the last point is the nature of globalization also dictates how our domestic economy also performs. If there are market access barriers, if there are high standards, if there are IPR regimes, if there is no technology transfer, then obviously the domestic growth process also is impacted adversely because of the globalization process. So how do you make the globalization process democratic? How the institutions of globalization, the global architecture of decision making in these institutions, how it can be democratized. So that also remains a major problem in the context of the SDGs. Goal 17 talks about these issues, but that is the, we have seen in the context of the MDGs, Goal 8 talked about this, and that was the weakest point. And in the context of SDGs also, Goal 17, I am afraid that it will remain the weakest point. In fact, as you know, in September 2015, SDGs were accepted by 193 countries at the highest level. It was a global summit. And 3 months later, there was the 10th WTO Ministerial Conference, and I was participating there. And what we saw is that, although 3 months back, the global heads of states agreed on these goals and targets, and it was said that the least developed countries will have market access and will have technology transfer, aid for trade facilitation. The commerce ministers of those countries, developed countries, did exactly the opposite. Exactly the opposite. The Doha round, which started in 2001, was virtually stalled. So I think that there is also a lot of global issues which will need to be really democratized and calibrated to support the domestic policies that we pursue at the domestic level. Without that also, I think that we cannot talk about inclusive growth. In fact, we cannot talk about really some of the major challenges that are not to be addressed at our level, not to speak about even inclusive growth. Thank you.
Thank you, Mustafizur. Our next panelist is Dr. Saman Kelegama, Executive Director, Institute of Policy Studies, IPS, which is the foremost think tank in Sri Lanka. Saman, we are glad to have you back in Dhaka. Saman Kelegama.
Thank you, Chair, and Professor Sobhan and other members of the high table, distinguished participants. First, let me record my thanks to SANEM for inviting me for this second annual conference. It's a great pleasure to participate in this event. My starting point will be the point that Selim highlighted about Sri Lanka's unique performance in South Asia in regard to physical quality of life index, basic need indicators, and human development indicators. Well, I think this achievement has been extensively discussed in the literature, why Sri Lanka achieved such standards. There have been debates where people like Amartya Sen, Ravi Kanpur, including Professor Osmani, has contributed his seminal paper in 1994 in Development and Change on the growth equity debate, shed quite a lot of light on this issue. What I will do is, first I will highlight some of these achievements without going into the growth equity debate, and highlight in managing the growth process the challenges that we are facing in social inclusion. Now, if we take the MDG goals, for instance, Sri Lanka managed to achieve the MDG goals far before 2015. In fact, even halving poverty, we achieved 7 years before the target date of 2015. In fact, the poverty level in the country was about 22.7% in the year 2002, and the current poverty level is about 6.5% in the country. So likewise, if you look at other indicators, primary enrollment is at 100% in schools. Secondary enrollment is at 98%. If we look at infant mortality or under 5 mortality, they are 8.3 and 9.6 per thousand live births. So I can keep quoting these statistics to show how well the country has performed. partly the free education system and the free health service system the country inherited from the British rule, which was nurtured and further improved over the years in the post-independent years, contributed to these achievements. In fact, after independence, certain other activities that the government undertook also have contributed quite a lot for social inclusion. Now, for example, if you look at electrification, 98.5% of the population have access to electricity. Then water supply, the percentage of population who have access to water supplies is above 85%. That is pipe-borne water. Sanitation above 85%, and so on. Even if you look at, for example, financial inclusion, according to the World Bank Global Financial Index in Sri Lanka is 83% for adults. Adults defined as above 15 years, compared to the South Asian average of 45.5%. And the percentage of adult women who have accounts in financial institutions in Sri Lanka is 83.1%, more than double of the South Asian average of 37.4%. So I can go on quoting such attractive statistics to show Sri Lanka's achievements. However, at present, Sri Lanka is facing a lot of challenges in having social inclusion in its growth process. Now, I will highlight 4 areas. The first item is that Sri Lanka's female labor force participation rates are very low. It's about 33% at this moment, compared to the male participation rate, which is about 75%. And this is an issue, and at this moment, the country is looking how more females could be brought into the labor force. Why? Because Sri Lanka, unlike many other countries, missed the demographic dividend. Because at the time of the youth bulge, when we had the youth bulge, the country experienced the war in the period 1981 till about the year 2009. That was the peak of the youth bulge. So after about 2006, the population, the youth bulge ended. So the country is now looking at whether this unutilized female labor force could be brought to the market to reap some sort of a diluted demographic dividend and bring more production to the overall economy. The second factor is that although the Sri Lanka has high basic need indicators and human development indicators, still 60% of the labor force is in the informal sector. Of course, it's lower than some other South Asian countries, which has a labor force around 80% of the labor force in the informal market, but yet they are excluded from pensions, then sick leave, and all other facilities, insurance schemes, etc., that the formal labor force is entitled to. Then, of course, there is rising inequality in the country. Though all these indicators are, which I mentioned, are very positive, the bottom decade, the poorest decile, the income they control has fallen from 2% in 1990 to 1.5% in the year 2002, while the richest, they have improved from 36% in 1990 to about 38% in the year 2012. So there is the widening income gap, and as Mustafizur mentioned, some of the areas that Professor Sobhan has highlighted in his book are very valid in the Sri Lankan social system. That is the social injustice, unequal access to assets, share ownership, etc. in the social system. These have not been addressed properly. Even the ownership, the tenancy system also is very much lopsided towards the rich people. So addressing income inequality is a equally important challenge. The final challenge we are facing is that with the high achievement of living standards in the country, Sri Lanka now is paying a price, that is at a low per capita income of $4,000, the population is rapidly aging. The above 60 years age population is in the year 2012 was 13%, and our estimate is by the year 2030, the above 60 years population would be 25%. So 1/4 of the population of the country will be above 60 years. Now in that context, the social protection system in the country is not geared at this juncture to meet this challenge, in the sense that the geriatric care, elderly home care systems, then the pension budget in the overall budget, which is escalating very rapidly. How to meet these challenges, the country has still not geared itself. And also, due to the war, which we experienced from 1983 to 2009, the population ratio of male to females have changed, in the sense that at this moment the female population is 53% and the rest is males. And in the aging process also, this is reflected. So there are many households with elderly females than males, even now, and this is going to aggravate further. So this is also a challenge that needs to be addressed, and it's not going to be that easy. So very briefly, the measures that the government is currently taking are as follows. There is a review of the social security system to improve quality rather than quantity, especially taking into account the rapid aging of the population and the non-participation of females in the labor force. And in regard to females, the government is trying to introduce flexible working hours, then enhancing the social security benefits on maternity and sick leave, and establishing suitable daycare centers at affordable prices for women in society. Then, of course, in regard to addressing some of the inequality issues, we have found that the Western province, 50% of the GDP of the country is concentrated in the Western province. So increasing connectivity through infrastructure development to the capital city is being worked out, so that this disparity is indirectly addressed. And finally, in regard to the informality of the labor force, we have estimated that the percentage of labor force in the agriculture sector is about 30%, but the agriculture sector's contribution to the GDP is only about 8%. So it's an inefficient agriculture sector we have, and it's the bulk of the labor force in the agriculture sector are the informal labor, with productivity being low. So in that context, number of programs are now being introduced to increase the productivity of the agriculture sector. Especially in the tea estate sector, we find that the the labor is gradually migrating out of the tea plantation sector and going for jobs like overseas in the Middle East, etc. Now, for this type of labor, the government is attempting to give some sort of a white-collar dimension to the blue-collar job in order to retain such labor, because already there are some signs of the country importing certain segments of labor because of shortages that the country is facing due to these demographic changes that are taking place. So all in all, to conclude, what I have to say is that although Sri Lanka looks very attractive in terms of human development indicators, it's facing a new set of challenges, and meeting them is not going to be easy. It's going to be a huge challenge in the coming years. Thank you.
Thank you, Saman. Lest I forget, I want to stress one point from your description of Sri Lanka's present situation is that, like Sri Lanka, which had a demographic transition quite early because of its social indicators progress, it seems that that couldn't be in time exploited, that benefit, so that you have landed in a situation where there is a saying in terms for individuals that you have to get rich before you become old. So that is a situation. But this is important, extremely important lesson for Bangladesh, because Bangladesh has had also a premature demographic transition because we did so well in population control and at a very relatively low level of per capita income, and low at a level where human skills are yet underdeveloped. We have entered into a demographic transition. So let's hope we won't get old before we get rich. This is an extremely important lesson for Bangladesh. Our next speaker, I have the privilege of inviting Dr. Posh Pandey, Executive Director, Institute of Policy Studies, Chairman, South Asia Watch on Trade, Economics and Environment, SAWTEE, Nepal.
Thank you, Chair, Professor Rehman, Sobhan, distinguished panelists, and friends. Well, on the issues of this growth and social inclusion, I would like to start with the process of economic development in South Asia. I mean, if we look at the growth rate, all South Asian countries, except Nepal and Pakistan, experienced rapid economic growth. That is, it's more than 5% for all the countries during 1.5 decades, to 2000 to 2015. And also the poverty was reduced significantly in all countries, both in terms of number and also in terms of share of people living below poverty line. And for South Asia as a whole, headcount ratio declined from 38.5% in 2000 to 15.1% in 2015. And the number of poor, I mean, people below poverty line, declined from 552 million in 2002 to 256 million in 2013. But if we look at the issue of equality or inequality, we will find some anomalies. I mean, we don't find inequality improving in commensurate with rate of growth or decline in poverty. I mean, in South Asia, still income inequality is high. And Gini coefficient, it is more than 30, for all the South Asian countries. And if we compare it, two periods, say 2000 and 2015, or latest available data, it has remained almost stagnant. And for most of the countries, and in case of Bangladesh, it has increased. I mean, these three parameters, what does that indicate? It indicates that growth process in South Asia has not been able to incorporate socio-political dimension and distributional consequences. Well, in the growth process, it has failed to include poor and marginalized, socio-economic groups as a partner and beneficiaries of growth process. And this kind of inequality, stagnant inequality, or rising inequality, also raises questions on the sustainability of this growth process as well. I mean, this inequality is not only bad from socio-political perspective, it is also bad from economic growth and from the perspective of economic growth and institutional development. In fact, inequality hinders human capital accumulation. And it is associated with unequal opportunity, which could lead wasted productive potential and inefficient allocation of resources. And it also hampers institutional development in the development process. And as Professor Mustafizur indicated, well, in post-2000 development agenda, we all committed to leave no one behind. That's the motto of SDG. And this inequality would be a big obstacles in achieving SDG. Well, here the question is, why development framework we have been pursuing for long did not sufficiently address the issue of inequality and inclusion? Is it bad policy? Is it bad instrument? Is it bad institution? Is it bad politics? Is it bad leadership? I think, we need to go beyond, this. And as, one of the authors, Monga, has said, we need to look at the idea level. Could be, we have bad idea. And that has resulted in this exclusion in the growth process and inequality. Okay, what is our conventional wisdom with regard to growth and inequality? That is the suggestion made by Kuznets, that relationship between inequality and level of development is inverted U. That is, inequality will naturally fall with maturity in the economy and with the industrialization process. And with that expectation, we have adopted the policy instrument that trade-off between equity and growth. And we emphasize more on growth rather than equity. And here, Dr. Mustafizur already mentioned the recent book of Piketty, Capital in 21st Century. And he has debunked the celebrated Kuznets' conjecture, and he had shown that R is always greater than, R means the rate of return, is always greater than the rate of growth, G. And that means there will be always concentration of profit or wealth with rising level of income. It could be because of globalization, it could be because of technological development, but the conjecture is there will always be concentration of wealth or profit with high rate of growth or high level of income. So if it is the situation, then we need to reverse our policy to achieve sustainable development and inclusive development. There are still some empirical studies that indicates that the responsiveness of poverty to income is decreasing function of inequality. That is, impact of economic growth on poverty would be low if there is high inequality. And inequality elasticity of poverty is larger than income elasticity of poverty. So, the policy implication of this empirical finding is that inequality could be better policy variable than growth in reducing poverty. Here it doesn't mean, we need to ignore, growth. And in fact, equality at low economic development is even worse than high inequality. Dr. Rehman, that could be the case for Nepal. We have very inclusive economy, but the situation in Nepal is worse than other South Asian countries because we achieve inequality, inclusion at a very low level of income.
And you have achieved, non-LDC status before Bangladesh.
No, we are still LDC. We are still LDC.
Before us.
So here, what could be the policy instrument for achieving economic growth which reduces inequality and is also socially inclusive? For me, the prerequisite is the state should act as developmental state, not merely a facilitator of a market or market system. When the situation demands or when it is required, the state should also act as a guide, coordinator, stimulator, and also catalytic agent for economic activities. And here, state should be strong. And for this, we can have fiscal, after having a strong state, developmental-oriented state, then we can have fiscal policy of redistribution and monetary policy with macro stability and structural reform to stimulate trade and to also to increase employment, to create job. And that also increases productivity. And in addition to this fiscal policy, we also need to adopt measures to address regional disparity. I need to address the issues of gender and also issues of marginalized group, which could ensure social inclusion in the growth process. Okay, thank you. I stop over here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Pandey. Our next panelist is Dr. Sabyasachi Kaur, Professor, Indian Institute of Economic Growth.
Yes. There is a downward trend. I have, thank you, Chair. I have three tremendous challenges in front of me now. The first one is that the biggest names on social inclusion have all spoken about social inclusion in South Asia, and everything that I had to say, not much, but everything has been already said. Very difficult for me to say anything new. The second challenge is that people are waiting for the dinner. And I don't want to prolong things too much. And on top of that, there's a third challenge. Selim wants me to explain why they have caught up with India. Let me try. I don't know which of the three I'll be able to do. So the topic is growth and social inclusion. Selim has requested me to throw some light on what's happening in India. So we start by asking which growth are we going to look at? And in the Indian context, there is a very natural point of break that helps this discussion. If you look at either the annual growth rates in the post-independence period or decadal growth rates, it's very easy to make out that somewhere around the 80s and 90s, the quality of growth changed in India. Of course, the magnitudes changed as well. You find that growth was much more volatile up to that point if you look at the annual growth rates. But after that, growth has been not only high, but also there has been very little volatility. So naturally, and this point of turnaround has also been associated with the adoption of market-friendly reforms. And a lot of literature has come up trying to look at whether this period, which is post-reforms, have been more or less inclusive in terms of various indicators. I would like to differentiate between two kinds of measures of social inclusion here, and these have been all touched by my previous speakers. There is the issue of, and we have to think about what we really want in terms of social inclusion, because there are these set of absolute measures and there is this set of relative measures. And what I would like to show is that while most analysis deal with both of them, but sometimes growth has contradictory effects on this. So in order to proxy for the absolute and the relative, I've just taken very rudimentary measures, poverty and inequality, and looked at what the existing literature says about what's happening in the Indian context. So here are the poverty rates in India. You have them from 1950 onwards. And there are two things that are striking in this. The first is that, of course, on a rough estimate, you can say that poverty rates were, almost stagnant during up to the 80s, although there was a little downward trend already starting, but on an average, they did not fall much. And then there has been a sustained decrease in poverty rates in the post-90s period, in the period after the reforms. And then there is another thing that you can see from this graph. You can see that in terms of rural and urban poverty rates, there has been a convergence over time. So while urban and rural poverty rates were pretty different for most of the pre-90 period, if you come up to 2010, they're almost identical. So poverty has now become in a very fluid. It flows from the rural sector to the urban sector. So that in a way, it's also useful for policymakers. If you take care of any one of them, probably you'll take care of all of them, because the factors that used to keep rural poverty distinct from urban poverty are increasingly going down. There's a lot of migration of labor into the urban areas, and that's probably the reason why this is happening. So to basically talk about these rates, there is obviously greater responsiveness to poverty, responsiveness of poverty going down to growth since the 90s. And this holds, if you look at various measures of poverty, you'll get the same result. But there's another interesting point here. Here this slide shows that is that the poverty has gone down not only because growth rates have gone up. Here is an estimate of the elasticity of poverty reduction to growth for alternative measures of poverty, and you'll see that the pre-91 period and the post-91 period shows significant different elasticities. So this underlines the fact that this poverty reduction that has happened with the high growth period is not simply because of the high growth. It's happening also because the elasticity of reduction has gone up. So I just want to talk a little bit about why this is happening in this period. And from what most people are, there's a consensus now that this is happening because if we take a step back and think about the ways through which poverty is reduced through growth, you can differentiate between direct effects of the growth process itself leading to less poverty, or indirectly through government measures. Now, what's happened during this period is that both have been working simultaneously. You are aware that in India we have started one of the largest employment guarantee schemes during this period, the NREGA. So what that has done is, and it provides, for those who are not aware of this, it provides 100 days of work to anybody who wants to work with a minimum guaranteed salary. And what that has done, apart from everything else, is it has led to a lowering of supply of labor to the private sector, to the other sectors of the economy. And at the same time, the demand for labor has gone up in this period because of the growth in certain sectors, particularly construction and real estate, which are really very labor intensive. So what we have got in this period is actually a positive impact on wage rates, real wage rates, because of these twin factors. And this high increase and there is a significant increase in real wage rates in this period, leading to this lower poverty because of this high growth rate during this period. But then I go to the next set of measures of inclusion, which are relative, and what's happening there. So here, what you see is that in terms of personal income, inequalities have started going up. They may not be actually, visible at the same time as the reforms, but urban inequality started going up quite early, even from the 1970s. And now the problem is that even rural inequality seems to be going up. And instead of the inverted U-shaped Kuznets curve, you have an actual regular U-shaped curve where inequality is going up rather than going down as income is increasing. There is another aspect of inequality in a large country like India. A lot of the social non-inclusion is also regional. There are large geographical areas which are very low, which are very backward, particularly areas near Bihar, UP, etc. So non-inclusion also takes the form of regional inequality. And what we see is that even in this, in terms of in this measure, the period of high growth has been leading to more and more unequal distribution of income. And finally, I think what is even more troubling is that the regional incomes are leading to what I call are polarized distributions of income. So in polarization, not only does your inequality go up, but they get clustered around groups. And when that happens, there is always the problem or fear of identifying high income states versus low income states, so that the conflict gets aggravated between states, etc., and between low income or non-included areas and included areas. And that's also something that has clearly been happening in India in the pro-reform area years. If you look at the upper diagram, it's an estimate of the distribution before the reforms. And you clearly see that in 1970s, although it was there were two modes, they became unimodal, one single mode, roughly around 88. But with the growth reforms and the growth that followed, by around 2007 and 2007-8, they again have become bimodal. So this is also aggravating the inequality and the inclusiveness of Indian economy. So let me just come to the concluding remarks. So what the high growth rates are obviously very successful in bringing down poverty in India. And this has been possible not only because of the high growth rates, but also the factors, the quality of the growth that is leading to real wages, rising real wages, lower poverty, etc. But clearly, in terms of various measures of inequality, we find that, relatively speaking, inclusion is, in fact, it has become an exclusionary kind of growth process. And so in future, the bigger challenge of social inclusion will not remain in terms of poverty so much as in terms of inequality in India. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we can continue up to almost 7. If you permit, let me pick a few quick points from what has been said, so far, and the points that our panelists raised, and then maybe Professor Rahman Saman, of course, will have the last words. But before that, let's see, we can accommodate some discussion from the floor. But would you permit me to just pick some few points from what has been said, some random points. I'll start from Mustafizur's point that on the one hand, we are the world community is looking forward to implementation SDG after MDGs. On the other hand, we have the world economic systems under WTO and other systems which are either working or not working so well. But the puzzle here, he sees this contradiction that the world economic system is not ordered in a way which can really support SDGs in developing countries. But the interesting point here one can ask is that we know, and there Stiglitz and all other pro-developing country economists have always said that the world economic order and the WTO and other agreements have been to the disadvantage of, has been unfair to developing countries. But the thing is that the anti-globalization popular movement in the form of Trumpism and Brexit has started in the developed countries. So there is a contradiction in that, and we should see why it is so. Maybe it's neither the developing countries or the developed countries which were discriminated or favored, but it was the multinationals which were favored rather than any set of countries. So this is one point I leave with you. The points raised by Saman that Sri Lanka had early achievements in human development indicators, which we all know, but still there is inequality. And when you compare per capita income and human development indices, both Sri Lanka and then Kerala, the early good performers in human development, one can say that they did well in human development compared to per capita income. But after so many decades, one can also say that they have done so well in human development indicators, but why not then have done so well in per capita income? And this runs, I mean, this is again a puzzle. If we believe in, say, policies advocated by Amartya Sen, that if you can raise human capabilities, invest in human capabilities, that's not only good in itself, but also will help economic development. But so the question here is, South Korea could do that. It developed human capital in terms of universal education, but that also was translated in higher growth. So how to translate human development or capabilities into higher growth it remains a puzzle, which means I think development economics has not yet solved the puzzle or the question of how to match capabilities at the individual and family level with economic opportunities that is created by growth others. So, so that we have Kerala and Sri Lanka, which are so developed in terms of human development, but their trained human resource has to go outside their countries to seek employment, particularly for Kerala. This is again, this is important because this is a lesson for us also, because we have done relatively well in human capital development at our per capita income level. That leads to Selim Raihan's initial exposition that ultimately, if countries can become rich, then there will be convergence and they will do good both in human development indicators, social development indicators, and per capita income. So at the end, it will be fine, provided we can reach there. But below that, in intermediate type of per capita income or even lower per capita income like ours, there is a large variation in human development, social development indicators relative to per capita income. So one direct conclusion from that is that whether human development can be translated into higher growth, that's one question. But even if that's not possible, at a per capita income, given per capita income, for that period, it's much better to have more human development so that there is more well-being at that per capita income. So if you compare two countries having same per capita income, why not have more human capital development, which is, after all, the combined with per capita income represents the well-being of the entire population. So even if countries like Sri Lanka or Kerala or Bangladesh at this moment, even if ultimately we cannot translate our better human development indicators into comparable high economic growth like North Korea, South Korea, even then in itself having better human development indicators at a given level of per capita income is itself an achievement. But if we can translate it to a higher income growth rate, that's even far, far better. And ultimately then we shall reach that convergence point. Does that make sense of what you? I am raising research questions. I am not really.
It can be a PhD topic, sir.
Sure. Particularly, Osmani can guide these research students on these topics. And on Dr. Sabyasachi, it's for India. We used to know that we used to say about one shining India, which is urban India, which is leaving behind the rural, poor rural India. Now it seems that there is a lot of percolation and flexibility between rural and urban areas, so that poverty is now really becoming more fluid between rural urban areas. But then if it is not a shining urban India leaving behind the rural underdeveloped and dark underdeveloped India, it's then within all sectors, within both rural and urban area, there is some part, dynamic part, which is growing much faster than the other part. So both in rural areas and urban areas, there must be sectors which are now dynamic and which are now creating, they are both dynamic and they are also inequalizing. So that the dynamic sectors, both in rural and urban areas, happen to be those sectors which are also inequalizing. So in a sense, I don't know whether it's inverted Kuznets or the real Kuznets. I'm becoming confused. It depends on what stage of per capita income it becomes like this and this. It can go up and down. But it seems that at some stage of growth, in modern growth, I think it may be that time has, technologies matter. In contemporary growth, any high growth seems to be inequalizing. I remember one, the empirical studies by Martin Rabelian and his colleague, who looked at the, with dozens of growth episodes across many countries, and the tentative general conclusion was that growth, high growth leads to higher inequality, but lower inequality to start with helps growth. This is something a bit looks paradoxical, but it only says that it implies that if growth is high and really is very inequalizing, then at the end that inequality will constrain sustainability of growth. So that its growth, high growth tends to be unequal these days with the type of technologies which have. It may not have been true in when South Korea was developing, but the new technologies like IT and other sectors which are highly inequitable. So that if we want to achieve growth, it tends to be inequalizing, but we should do everything possible to keep it as more equalizing as possible, so that that growth can be sustainable. Otherwise, if we know that there are, I mean, in development literature, we have discussed so much about the relationship between growth and economic growth and inequality. There is one new dimension, new aspect of why high inequality is maybe bad for sustaining good growth enhancing policies is one perspective which has been I have learned from Siddiq Osmani, which is that if there is inequality which is not necessarily created by good policies, policies that are good for growth, but the demagogues and populist leaders can use that inequality as an excuse for propagating demagogic populist policies like what is happening in Brexit and Trumpism. It's true that globalization, unhindered globalization, is quite to some extent responsible for creating inequality among countries and within countries, but it doesn't mean that globalization has been all bad. I mean, on balance, most of the economic growth in the last few decades throughout the global economy has been because of globalization. So, but one can throw away the baby with, I have forgotten that phrase, throw away the baby, by the sort of Trump. Okay, now we have, yes, we have, we can 15 minutes and Sir can talk for 20 minutes for some floor discussions.
This idea of poverty being fluid, we heard from India actually. Before we conclude on that, in the Bangladesh context, what we find is that if we look at the detailed indicators of poverty, not just the economic consumption indicator, we find an interesting divergence between rural and urban poverty trends. In rural areas, income improvements is mirrored in human development improvements. In the urban areas, income improvements is not mirrored in human development indicators. So that, for example, in the slums of Dhaka, the child malnutrition rate is worse than the average rural malnutrition rate, or even the education and health access indicators are worse, sanitation, for example. So I think it's important when we, while there is an element of this mobility implied in that fluidity conclusion, that the urban poverty presents newer types of challenges, which has to be factored in their own right. One other point, I think Wahiduddin has raised an extremely interesting observation about we have human development achievements, but are they translating into growth achievements also? And contrasting the example of South Korea, one hand, and Kerala and Sri Lanka on the other. And I think that's an extremely interesting observation to dwell upon. Here, I would like to suggest also that perhaps one of the answers we'll have to explore is the particular ideology through which the human development policies were pursued. You know, pursuing human development policy from a rights perspective, which came actually from the Brazilian philosopher Paulo Freire, that he influenced this, consciousness and all that. That's, some countries really have focused on that. Kerala would be, perhaps that would be it. In contrast, you have, for example, in Northern Europe, Bishop Grundtvig, who at a level of Paulo Freire, another major philosopher, who proposed this human development, education, where somehow the skills issue got a much greater focus, and the rights aspect was not denied at all, but it's a orientation type. So I think it may be interesting to explore what are the ideological frameworks through which we are pursuing our human development strategies. Thank you.
I think we should dwell upon the conceptualization of poverty first. If we conceptualize it as at an absolute level, and that level is very low, then it is easy to cross. And any society growing at a certain stage will cross it, and we will say it has become an inclusive society. But if we think in relative terms, for example, in a primitive society where everybody is equal to each other and may not feel excluded, but all the people of the primitive society may prefer a slavery because there the absolute level is above everybody's what it was before. So that is the problem in the index. The index concentrates on absolute level measurements, and that's how it is ranking. But if it would have measured poverty in relative terms, as was suggested in the seminal paper of 2000 World Bank Development Report, where Ravellian has argued that poverty should have been defined in relative terms, and he was proposing a different index. He was saying that anybody below the 1/3 of the per capita income should be considered as poor. In that sense, capitalism can never eradicate poverty. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for giving me the chance to ask questions. So I have one comment and two questions. So the comment is, so we cite Thomas Piketty a lot, which is fine. I think he has done an excellent job along with recently deceased Anthony Atkinson to bring forth inequality in our kind of regular discourse. But that's not the only way we actually measure inequality. So for example, net wealth is what he basically used. But just think about a regular person in the USA with a job but large student loan. The net worth is negative, but he's definitely much better than many other people around the world. So for example, in terms of income equality, the things actually show up much better. And a very negative perception of the reality can actually lead to very bad political outcome, as we have seen in the USA and probably in the UK as well. So I have one question to the entire panel, and which is the role of technology has not been addressed so much. I think it is extremely important. It has implication for hollowed out labor market outcomes. So the mid-skilled people will go out of job, and the very low skill and very high skill people will end up having any decent job, which has a huge implication for inequality. Automation, robotics. So there's a paper by some engineers from Oxford that 42% of the economist job can become obsolete because of automation. Historians are actually even worse condition. They're 43%, so I'm not sure how it works, but apparently it seems like being father of 2 kids, it keeps me awake at night. Second question is actually very specific to Dr. Selim Raihan, Selim as I call him. So you have, we have the, what is the managing growth for social inclusion in quotation. So it seems like we can manage social inclusions through redistribution, through tax, through free education, through healthcare. But can we really manage growth? I mean, that seems like an outcome, intended or unintended outcome of different social inclusion policy. So, so I'm a little confused. What exactly do you mean by that subtitle?
Thank you. I'm very much hopeful of Bangladesh and also South Asia. I give one example, in Rajshahi district, the Bagmara Upazila. Okay, sir, just. Here I found if you can skill train the local, especially the young people, nearly 500 paramedics we trained in one Upazila. And we found how that creates not only jobs, they are economical standard, even they have 3-story big clinics also there. Similar way, I also found that the change of food habits, that if we eat less rice and eat more vegetables, then we can recover more agricultural land. Then housing in rural areas, if at least we can go two-star houses, cooperative based like in housing in cities, then you will find in the rural areas, dramatical change will take place. What we need the role of policymakers, NGOs, media, all has to mobilize people to go in that direction. Thank you.
Sir, actually, sir, the inequality at certain level, to whom it to be attributed? Either the societal and the governmental actual activities, or the person or the individual himself is also maybe a reason to create some inequality. My question is that certain level of development, everyone may not be interested to reach the peak or to be equal to others. So, but others may be interested to be in the higher positions. So there will be someone always who may not be opted to get all the benefits of the markets or the government. So it depends on the person or individual also. Thank you, sir.
Okay, we are running short of time. We have to close this session now. Now, if it is for 30 seconds, I can. 30.
স্যার আমি একটু বাংলাতেই বলবো, শেষে প্রশ্নটা থাকবে ইংরেজিতে। বঙ্গবন্ধু বলেছেন যে এবারের সংগ্রাম স্বাধীনতার সংগ্রাম, এবারের সংগ্রাম মুক্তির সংগ্রাম। আর 10ই জানুয়ারিতে যখন আসলেন 72-এ, তখন বলছিলেন আমার বাংলার দুঃখী মানুষের মুখে হাসি ফুটাতে চাই। তো অনেকগুলি ইন্ডিকেটার্সে তো বাংলাদেশের আমরা লক্ষ্য করছি আমরা এগিয়ে গেছি, কিন্তু যেটা রহমান সোবহান স্যার সাউথ এশিয়ান সামিটে বলছিলেন একটা সুন্দর কথা, সে যে আমরা ভয়ঙ্কর সময় পার করছি। তা আমার কাছে মানে এটা পাজল লাগতেছে। তো এখন প্রশ্নটা হচ্ছে স্যার, নির্মোহ নিরিখে এবং নিরপেক্ষ বিবেচনায় আসলে যে লক্ষ্য ছিল আমাদের স্বাধীনতার, বৈষম্যহীন সমাজ, সাম্য, মানবিক মর্যাদায় এবং সামাজিক সুবিচার প্রতিষ্ঠায় আমরা রাষ্ট্রগতভাবে এবং গুণগতভাবে কত দূর এগিয়েছি? প্রশ্নটা ইংরেজিতে। ইন বাংলাদেশ ইন ফিউচার, how you see the development, democracy and governance, totally inclusive growth প্রশ্নে বাংলাদেশ কোন দিকে যাচ্ছে এই ব্যাপারে যদি একটু স্যার আলোচনার মধ্যে আলোকপাত করেন।
Okay, yes, we will have the privilege now of listening to Professor Rahman Sobhan. Among the panelists, if there is any small point you want to explain or anything very quickly. We can't solve all this problem.
Yeah, I mean, very rich questions. I'll only handle Sillur's question about the ideology. I think ideology can play a role in the sense that, you know, how people's mindset is shaped. Now, in Sri Lanka, for example, several regimes tried to curtail some of the measures of the welfare state, but they found it extremely difficult to do that politically because of resistance from the people. Some people tend to consider it as the inalienable right to have these welfare measures. So any fee imposition, etc., was heavily resisted. Now, in regard to the human resource development and overall per capita income, you see now in countries like South Korea, the macroeconomic policy environment, predictability and consistency of the policy regime, outward orientation, all that went in parallel with the human resource development. I'm afraid in some of the South Asian countries, Kerala, Sri Lanka, I don't think those areas of policy, there was anything comparable to that of South Korea. But there are many explanations. I mean, this needs a detailed study. Thank you.
I think we now ঠিক আছে বাদ দিয়ে দিই স্যারকে বলি just 15 minutes. Sir, over to Professor Rahman Sobhan.
Thank you. Greetings to all of you. One of the problems of in Bangladesh being a chief guest or a guest of honor is that you get to speak last. Now, in most meetings, this in practice means that most of the audience has also left by that time. So why I now commend Selim and SANEM is that actually he has retained a very full house of both our professional peers and students. So congratulations. To, of course, attend this function organized by Selim and his colleagues, I also feel a great sense of pride, as does Wahid, because Selim, after being well taught by Wahid, then had his first job at CPD and began his working career over there. Now he is a professional economist of high international recognition, and he demonstrates that the next generation of economists after people like Usmani are full of promise and can in fact actually demonstrate that we have acquired and accumulated significant capability. SANEM, I think, has emerged as an excellent organization where serious professional research takes place, and this is to be commended. Now, the theme of this session itself of managing growth for social inclusion in South Asia raises all sorts of questions of both concept and policy. Now, this being a largely professional audience, it is easier for me to address some of the conceptual issues, because from this will derive the sort of policy conclusions which actually follow. Now, I think it was pointed out, perhaps by Usmani and some others, that what is very significant today is that in the richest countries of the world, led by Trumpistan and the European Union, you now have huge sense of injustice really driving the political process, whether rightly or wrongly, or whether the notions are conceptually robust or not. The end result of widening social and economic disparities has really had a very significant political fallout, in which a person who it was quite unimaginable could become the president of any place could actually get elected as the president of the most powerful and at the moment, or at least briefly more so, the richest country in the world. This essentially means that the concept of inequality itself and its social and political outcomes needs very serious rethinking. This was not an issue which was disturbing anyone's sleep in the Western capitalist countries, but now it certainly is. And not only did they produce Mr. Trump, who, to use the Bangladesh expression, high court dekhai American electorate ke, that he could create a completely sort of deceptive notion of an agenda which he is in no position to implement in order to mobilize an excluded constituency. But the election campaign also produced a self-confessed socialist who wasn't even a registered Democrat until he contested the Democratic primary against Hillary Clinton, and could mobilize huge numbers of people who would donate $25 in order to finance a major election campaign against the big money of Hillary Clinton and almost win the nomination. So this indicates that there is a wind blowing through the world, and it is manifesting itself in the richest countries. It is no accident that areas of extreme violence are emerging again in energy-rich parts of the world, with huge inequalities and injustice guiding their societies. So let us keep in mind that tackling inequality is not just a value, it also has significant instrumental implications, both for purposes of politics and also, as I will try to very briefly indicate, it also has significant instrumental value for promoting growth and development, which somehow has completely escaped the conversations of economists, where for long periods of time, issues of growth and inequality were seen as either-or issues. I remember in the whole Sri Lankan discourse of the 60s and 70s, where even Joan Robinson would be lecturing us on how could you have such an advanced social agenda at such low levels of growth, and these were perhaps interrelated. Now, the point I wish to make over here is initially a conceptual one. Looking at the observations which were made and also the specific presentations, I see that there is a considerable degree of imprecision in the way in which concepts such as inclusion are in fact actually utilized in the political discussion. And similarly, the way in which inequality is interpreted. Now, I would want to bring out over here that we should recognize that at the end of the day, inequality is an outcome, which has, of course, is in the terms of the economic profession, certain quantitative measures usually associated with the Gini coefficient, which you are familiar with. Whereas inclusion is both an outcome and a process. And this is a very important distinction to recognize, because inclusion, seen as a process, will then determine levels of both inequality and the nature of growth as it takes place in society. This, I think, is a very central element that you have to recognize. So we should not, in our conflations, in our conversations, treat these as interchangeable terms, and then at the end of the day, not really draw any robust conclusions in terms of what you want to do about it. Because it is only when you establish this level of clarity in terms of what you are talking about that you can get a clearly identified agenda for policy interventions. Now, I have asked Selim to circulate this paper on addressing the structural sources of inequality in South Asia, where I attempt to make the points which I will be making very briefly, more elaborately. But the focus of this and my earlier book on challenging the injustice of poverty is to not just make an argument, but to relate this to whether we can actually do anything about it. Because at the end of the day, beginning with the Kuznets curve, everyone tends to think of inequality as a sort of endogenous process, which you then sort of derive from coefficients of growth, which will then enable you to calculate poverty and even now inequality. But actually, that is hardly the case. I mean, the whole issue of the sort of levels of equality and inequality you have are deeply related to the processes of inclusion that are put in place. Now, even the whole inclusion agenda has a great deal of confusion attached to it, because there too, there is a confusion over addressing processes and outcomes. I remember being invited to attend a famous international conference in New Delhi, organized, I think, by Sonia Gandhi, of all people, who was wanting to explore the prospects of India becoming a social democratic society. I'm not quite sure what inspired her to organize an international discussion with Stieglitz and other people attending. But our opening session was addressed by the then Prime Minister, Dr. Manmohan Singh, who then began, the theme of his argument was that, well, India is already a social democratic society because we have got an inclusive agenda incorporated. I think it was then the 6th five-year plan, and that this is being done through interventions of social protection and manifested through a variety of social safety nets, including the NRGA, as if this was essentially addressing the central notion of inclusion. But as all of the people here have pointed out in our discussion, whilst you are doing all this, you are aiming for universal primary education, you are leading to high rates of immunization in healthcare, you're leading to reductions in absolute poverty. In every country, there are significant increases, and in fact, this derives even from the Gini index using household income inequality surveys. There are significant widenings of inequality. Now, the big problem, of course, with the measures of inequality in South Asia and more or less anywhere else is that actually they are very unsatisfactory. The Gini coefficient using household income and expenditure data is a profoundly unsatisfactory measure of inequality because it largely fails to capture the huge accumulations of income at the higher end of the scale, because obviously those people who are going to the houses of the exceedingly well-off people will not even be, the BSS surveyors will not even be allowed to enter the gate of that household in order to, in fact, actually collect data from there. So the notion somehow that we are accurately measuring inequalities is hardly the case. And what you therefore are largely left with is both, you may say, visual evidence, again, manifested in the sense of social disquiet and increasing tendencies to violence and aggressive challenges to the authority of the state, as also to those of people of wealth. After all, anyone needs to take a visit to Ashulia, where some activity may be going on about 3 times a week, to get some idea of what is happening in our most prosperous and dynamic industry. I mean, if anyone thinks that a rural woman coming from the rural areas who is working 8 or 10 hours a day, who is walking 1.5 miles from a basti to attend work and is going back after dark to that same basti, where you may or may not have access to proper running water, may in fact even have had her minimum wage raised. But when she sees the people for whom she works, in fact, enjoying levels of education and healthcare in Singapore and opportunities of higher education for their children, and she is conscious of where her kids are being educated and the sort of health facilities she faces, if you think that merely by taking her above the income poverty line or even raising her real wages, she is a deeply happy and satisfied person, and that deep anger is not nurtured within her, then we are making a grave, grave social mistake, which may eventually have serious political consequences in the future. Now, this, I think, has to be recognized, because the whole issue of inequality then needs to be addressed in terms of the actual disparities which exist in society. And the point I wish to make over here is that addressing the inequalities which derive from the processes of growth in society is important both for absolute reasons, because it is a value, after all, which religion in the world would tell you that these levels of social division are in fact acceptable, and that if you live in societies with such visions, you are also going to be guaranteed a place in whatever concept of heaven actually exists. I mean, these are seen as deeply offensive, and therefore they are already important values built into our social order, apart from the more modernizing values that have really emerged and taken their place. But I would point out that there are also very important instrumental reasons for the growth process itself. And this is where the whole issue of agendas arise. Now, the classical measures of addressing inclusion, to cite Manmohan Singh and many others, is to point to all the social protection programs which have been put in place. My dear friend and colleague, who in fact has been setting the agenda of promoting human development, Amartya Sen, has certainly led the way in putting priority in the allocative agendas and consciousness of the world on promoting healthcare and on promoting emphasis on education. He has made the important point that these are associated with enhancing human capabilities, which is a very important measure of addressing the issues of injustice in society. But the problem in all elements of broad categorization and aggregation is that this really does not capture the essence of the problem. I mean, to take the simple issue of education. Now, obviously, there is a very popular belief, which was made more popular by our embrace of the MDGs, when we said that we must reach a level of universal primary education. Now, in the SDGs, I think the goal is to attain 10 years of schooling, and that these then are acceptable targets around which we can actually congratulate ourselves. But this is hardly the problem today. I mean, the problem today, and always for that matter, has been the deep inequalities in the qualities of education available to people. And even as opportunities for education expand, the inequalities within the educational system are growing. For many of you over here, this would be familiar. I would cite a very simple example in the context of Bangladesh. Now, there would be people of a generation over here, including my partner, Professor Raunak Jahan, who received all her initial education up to the intermediate level in Bangla medium Zilla schools across Bangladesh. She was in Bhola, she was in Munshiganj, she was in Kumilla, where her father was posted in the service. She did not actually get taught in English until she came to Eden College for her intermediate examination. But out of that process, she could stand first, get first classes, and then have the benefit of getting a government scholarship for spending 3 years in Harvard to do her PhD, and to in fact become a PhD holder of Harvard before she was 25 years old. Now, what does that example and lesson teach you? That at the end of the day, today, can you imagine anyone going to a school in Munshiganj aspiring to become a PhD in Harvard today? Come on now, I ask you. So look at the changed trajectories of opportunity, which in fact exist in our societies here and elsewhere. Now, if in fact there are hundreds of Raunak Jahans, perhaps 100,000, perhaps 1 million, languishing in our rural areas, in our district schools, who have the potential of becoming Harvard PhDs, then think of the huge waste of accumulated skills and resources which are lying congealed within the people of Bangladesh. This enormous capacity, which if you could actually bring to the surface, what would it actually do to the growth processes of Bangladesh? Just apply your imagination to that possibility. Now, if you want to take the real lessons of, say, East Asia and the lessons also of Europe, it is quite wrongly believed that it was just guaranteeing them education. This was obviously very important, and it's the first stage. And I think it was a wrong conclusion to draw from the East Asian experience. What was very significant about Japan, about South Korea, Singapore, Taiwan, China, is that they ensured quality education for all people. And they ensured most of it through state schools, funded from state budgets. So this led to a huge widening democratization of educational opportunity to a great mass of the population, which again is inconceivable in the context of South Asia. Sri Lanka is better than ours. In fact, some of the studies we did for our book on challenging injustice, comparing the Bangladesh and Sri Lankan educational system, showed that Sri Lanka has a much wider access to state education, and as a consequence, the average quality of schooling in Sri Lanka is significantly better than in Bangladesh. But even there are huge disparities in educational opportunity. Now, if you look at contemporary Bangladesh today, not only are disparities at the urban-rural level, but between the schools attended by the elite kids, are now being divided not only by private educational quality, but even by language, so that any self-respecting elite, and many who aspire to be that, are now sending their children, even though it's worth mentioning, this is the month of February, they are sending their children to English medium schools. Now, those who are not having that opportunity and cannot afford that opportunity, you visualize the opportunity structures available to them. So that if you want both growth and equity, then one of the central elements is to get people on a sense of equivalence in terms of access to education. Now, in my work, I have, of course, addressed other areas of inequality and the need for intervention. Obviously, assets. At the end of the day, if you want people to compete in the marketplace, you need to invest them with access to productive assets and, of course, productive skills. So they can then enhance their productivity of goods and services. Now, the whole issue of asset redistribution, except in the area of access to microcredit, has virtually fallen off the agenda because no one really addresses the problems of agrarian reform anymore. Now, again, to use the Bangladesh example, obviously the old style agrarian reform where you take surplus land from big landowners, though of course actually now, if you look at some of your property developers, they are owning huge tracts of land grabbed from farmers, which are then being converted to property development. Now, obviously, no land ceiling, even of the 100 bigha variety, applies to these people. But today, at least, there is opportunity in Bangladesh because there is all this khas land available to the government. Abul Barkat, I think, estimates that there is about 4 million acres of that. But all this is being grabbed through the illegal use of political influence, and people are hanging on to it when, in fact, the major policy agenda of the state should be reappropriate this and to redistribute this, either if in the urban areas for housing for the lower income households, or in the rural areas for, in fact, actually productive agriculture. The literature on attempts by some of the left parties to recapture some of this khas land and the huge problems which were faced by them gives you some idea of the nature of the problem. Now, of course, this is never going to be enough because the other area which is hardly at all discussed in the literature on equity and distribution is the whole inequality created through the market mechanism itself. Now, every day you pick up the newspapers in Bangladesh and someone will be complaining that we have now got a bumper crop of potatoes, but the price of potatoes has fallen 50%, and so they are facing bankruptcy. Someone else is claiming that they are producing some other commodity, but in fact the market has fallen and this is creating a crisis for them. This is because all those small farmers and producers who are in many ways the most efficient and competitive in terms of rates of return on their capital invested are operating at the lowest tiers of the market. I mean, after all, if you look at the way market functions, they sell their goods at the primary level. It has gone through a whole range of intermediation, and then before it ends up on your table. This is the way in which resources are distributed. Now, if you want, again, to promote equity, and you want to provide incentive structures which will in fact motivate the small primary producers of goods and services to be much more efficient by incentivizing them, you have to find ways and means of linking them to the higher tiers of the market. I mean, my favorite example of that is the famous case of Amul dairy in India, where in fact, I think, what is it, about 2 to 3 million small dairy farmers owning 1 or 2 or 3 cows, in fact, own the largest agro-processing enterprise in India. And they not only, in fact, can collectively market their produce, they can add value to it so that the original milk collected ends up on the tables of the urban elite, producing cream and butter and cheese and chocolates and a whole variety of other things. And they are in a position to share in that value addition process. I tried to persuade Pran to, in fact, actually carry out such an experiment with their contract farmers, but I think they were not too keen to move beyond contracting with producers and giving them opportunities to become shareholders in Pran. Now, moving on from there, that at the end, markets are very critical. So that if you are a handloom weaver and you are selling your shari to a Mahajan, who is then going to market it in Shari Kuti or some other big urban outlet in Dhaka, you are going to get different levels of return. So the relevant way in which you would address their problems, which would be both incentivizing and equitizing, would be again to link them up with the higher tiers of the market. Now, the two other areas, and I will quickly sum this up over here, which I have addressed in my work, are on issues of governance. Now, you don't need to be a sort of serious research scholar, you just have to live in any South Asian society to know in the way you access both administrative resources and legal enforcement. Today, if you are a poor person and someone commits a crime against you, you could probably not even get it registered in a police station. On the other hand, if you have actually committed a crime, in many cases you can make sure it is never registered because you have made corresponding alternative arrangements. So again, your access to the resources of governance vary widely. In its most extreme form, if you look at the ultimate institutions of governance, the elective process. Today, who contests elections in any part of South Asia? Who makes up the composition of our legislatures all over the region? There are people with resources. Where do you get poor people in a position to contest elections? Today, the likes of Tufail or Bangabandhu or Tajuddin, who came from lower middle class backgrounds with very limited incomes, who contested elections, roaming around on rickshaws and riding buses to organize their political parties, could not actually contest elections because they would simply not be able to afford it and would not actually get political nominations. This is the problem again across this region. Don't feel isolated and special in this in Bangladesh because we have got a huge South Asian cooperation in the way in which elites have actually captured our elective institutions. Now, in a situation where, in fact, access to political power through elective bodies has again really become a part of a business investment, obviously those who make the investment are then going to expect returns from that investment out of that process. So that the elective bodies of this part of the world, and I suppose the United States for that matter, have really become an extension of the business processes. I suppose here, what is the word you actually use? Deals. Deals. Yes, a deals universe has now been created between state and business, and the elective institutions
You have been
that
following
you
that
have.
theory.
Oh, yes, very much so. Very carefully. So I've been trying to understand it and seeing living examples of the deals
Increase
process.
vocabulary.
Uh-huh. So in these circumstances, you live in a world in which this is the sort of governance processes where ranging from your representation, your ability to be heard, your access to the administration, your enforcement of laws, your protection of the law enforcement agencies are all hugely disequalizing. So under those circumstances, to talk about a universal rule-making system is really not some sort of objective, measurable entity, but has deep distributive implications in your society. And you have to, all the indices which you have constructed, these all have to be constructed now hierarchically. And it will determine then that at each of these levels, you get different readings of the index in any given society over here. So to just take a single number and draw a conclusion from this is very deeply misleading. And then at the end of the day, you have a very unjust and disequalizing global order. And what is the most elementary example of that? Again, go back to the garment industry. Now, today, if Walmart buys a shirt in Bangladesh, its unit cost will be $2, $3. If it's a higher quality shirt, it may go up to $5 or $6. When it ends up on a market at Walmart in the United States, it is going to be marketed at $20, $25, $30, $40, $50. Now you as economists, and I keep telling economists this, have to find out, how do you explain this huge price disparity? What is actual cost of marketing? What is rent? Because there are obviously, it is inconceivable that 80 to 85% of the cost of a shirt at Walmart is all actual distribution costs. So there is a rent. How is that rent appropriated? Where exactly is it distributed? I know of no working economist. I know that Nazneen Ahmed at BIDS and a number of others have at least attempted to explore that possibility. But the actual substantive research to, in fact, actually identify the value chains and then the political economy of its distribution remain an unaddressed agenda in the political economy discourse. So, to end this, let us not think of inequality as simply a number, and let us not think that we can derive comforting conclusions about this by, in fact, understanding whether we are part of a deals universe or whether, in fact, if we grow a bit, then the Kuznets curve will have a sort of upward movement over here. These are all humanly created outcomes of the injustices which have been accumulated over history and society. These are not endogenously derived from the functioning of the economy. This is the essential part of all that I have attempted to say. I obviously say it very imperfectly in very bad English or whatever language I like, because no one actually seems to read this. So anyway, that is my failure, not yours. But at the end of the day, this is the essence of the problem. So if anyone actually seriously wants to have a understanding and a conversation, not just about inequality, but much more significantly, can we actually do anything about it? Then you have to understand the sources and the institutions which have produced and reproduced and aggravated inequalities in all our societies, and relate this then to the inherent injustices which in fact really guide the political economy process in our respective societies. If you look at it from that perspective, we may begin to do something about inequality and the injustices which originate. Since we do not even recognize the problem, and our profession has taken very little cognizance of this aspect of the problem, who is surprised that you live in unequal, disequalizing societies, and the only reminders you will get of that sort of society is when some explosion lands on your head. Thank you.
Thanks to our distinguished guests.
Thank you, sir. You have learned a lot, and I think one of the value added of this seminar, one-day seminar, is not only that we have heard from our speakers, panelists from other countries, but also that sir has endogenized in his analysis the New Deals concept, whether that deals are endogenously determined and we are all part of that deal, including sir, or it is exogenous. That's something I think we should hear in future from you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks to our distinguished guests and panelists for a very enlightening discussion. Now I would like to move on to our crest presenting ceremony. We have already had the pleasure of presenting crests to two of our panelists here, Dr. Posh Pandey and Dr. Sabyasachi in our earlier sessions. Hence, I would like to request our Honorable Chair, Professor Wahiduddin Mahmud, to please present crests to Dr. Saman, Kelegama, and Dr. Mustafizur Rahman. Thank you. Now I'd like to request our Honorable Chair, Professor Wahiduddin Mahmud, to kindly accept his crest from Dr. Selim Raihan. I would now like to request Dr. Selim Raihan, sir, to kindly present the crest to our guest of honor, Professor Rehman Sobhan.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for bearing with us all day.